Chapter 13 of History of Japan in words of one syllable. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Rick Vina. History of Japan in words of one syllable by Helen Ainslie Smith. Chapter 13. The Ashikaga Age. The race of the Ashikaga, whose plots so soon broke up the Mikado's sway, kept hold of the reins of the realm for 250 years. 13 of its sons were shoguns, and in all their time you can find but one bright page in the long, sad tale of their age, when ill will was in the air, and there were fights for small clan feuds all the time, and now and then for great ones, when the whole land would be drawn into war. In the time of the Hojo, it had been the right of the court to say who should hold the post of shogun, and then you know it was the shiken who had the shogun in their hands, so that they had no might of their own. But when the Ashikaga then got the post for their own race, and had it go from sire to son, the man with the rank was not at all times the man who had the sway. Much of the real work of the state was done by smart men, not of high rank. One of these, Hosokawa Yoriyuki, was a great man both at books and in arms. None of the men who had charge of the shogun's work in the Ashikaga age were so great as he, who tried to raise the folks from some of their poor ways, and took more than one step to drive out some of the great wrongs in the forms of rule. He held his post in the name of the Ashikaga heir, Yoshimitsu, whom he was to teach and take care of till he should reach the age when he might rule. He did not do as old Tokimasa did with the son of Yoritomo, but gave much thought to have the youth learn a great deal from the best men in the realm, from books, and in all the arts of war. He saw that his friends were well-taught young men of first rank, with gifts and skill for all that a young Japanese lord of those days should know. This lad was the grandson of the sire of the house, and was the one man of his race who bore the name of the great Ashikaga. He was made shogun and put at the head of the troops when he was but 10 years old, and ere long he won great fame by his brave acts in the wars of the South and West. But through one rash act, the cause of which must have been his great love for war, he brought down the curse of his land on his race, as well as on his own head. This act was that he sent a band of Japanese to China near the year 1400 with gifts and fine words, by which they made it known to the proud emperor of that vast realm that Yoshimitsu felt that this great Mongol had a sort of right to be the chief of Japan as well as the rest of the East, but that he would beg him to own that Yoshimitsu was Nippon, or King of Japan. It seems to have been done for naught else than to get for the shogun the grand name of king. He he did not dare to try to get the Mikado's throne, though he had long dwelt in as much style as his lord. There was no real cause why the realm should have been made to thus bow her head to China, and the man who did it brought hate on his name for all time. If the whole land had not been in a bad state, he could not have done this base thing, and as long as his house held the reins of the realm, in name or in fact, things went from bad to worse. In these days there was a great deal of change at the head of the state. Sometimes the rule was at Kyoto, where both the Mikado sat with the court that ruled him, and the great Shogun with his Shikken, more than one of whom in this age held the reins from both the Shogun and the Emperor. Sometimes the seat of rule would shift to Kamakura, where a plain Shogun had sway, or was the tool of a man whose rank was not as great as his own, though he had more strength of will. Much of the time the heads of the two towns were in feuds, as were the clans of most all the realm, so that not much else took place in the land but fights for clan pride, for rights to lands, and no end of such things. Each clan chief dwelt in a great house that was like a fort, and in whose walls dwelt scores of his men with their wives and small folks. The homes of the monks of Buddha, too, were like the store rooms of a great guard house. More than once it was by their aid that a side won. To be in trim for war was the plan of all who could bear arms. This strife went on for years and years. Towns were burnt, fields laid waste, all were made poor, and the folks of high birth as well as the low fled to the hills, where they might dwell in caves to be out of the sound of strife. And young folks grew up with no one to teach them. By and by dearth came, as it does in all lands in the wake of war, and thousands of folks, young and old, died for the want of food. Men who had been born to live on farms were made to join the ranks at arms, while some of them grew to be thieves, and spent their time in raids on towns or on the roads, where they would rob anyone they could catch. And the Mikado was as bad off as his folks. He had no wealth. He dwelt at Kyoto, which was at all times in the hands of a force at arms. If not those of the great Shogun, then it was those of Kamakura, the troops of the East. To this day, if the Japanese want to tell a tale of great woe and wrongs, or if they want to make a play of folks who did no end of bad things, they say it all came to pass in the time of the Ashikaga. It was near the close of this age, in the year 1542, that a great man by the name of Nobunaga came on the scene to throw down the sway of the proud house that had brought so much ill luck to the realm, to break up the bad ways of the Buddhist priests, give a good word to a new faith, and bring back in part at least the old and long-lost might of the Mikado. He came from a race of Shinto priests, but far back he could trace his blood to the great Kiyomori and the house of Taira. His sire had borne arms, and as most of the men of any note in those days, his aim in life was to get hold of all the lands he could win. When he died, he left his arms, his land, and his feuds to his tall, brave son, who bore his charge well. 6 fiefs, or states, did he add to those of his sire, and much wealth did he gain, so that in a few years he rose to much note in the realm. In Kyoto he built him a fine house, a castle. He was so great that he had the man of his choice made shogun, in spite of all those who did not want him could do. In one of the old books of Japan it is told that this prince was a man of large frame, but of fine, pale skin, which the Japanese do not think well of in a man. But the book says that he had a heart and soul that made up for all else he might lack. He was brave and bold, and held high thoughts on what was right and wrong, and would see that folks had their just dues in all things where he had a voice, and it was not long ere he had a voice in all things. His wit was keen, his will strong, and it was a rare thing for him to be wrong in his plans, though his foes did call him Lord Fool at first. He had been taught in all the arts of war, and of all men of his time he was known to be the best to take charge of a set of troops, to mark out a camp, lay a siege, or hold out when one was made on him. He made use of no head but his own. Now and then he would ask for the views of those who were with him, but it was more to find out their hearts than to have the aid of their brains. He read the hearts and the minds of all the men he met, but he let no man read him, and when he made up his mind to do a thing, he gave the word, and it was done. He had no small ways, and held no mean thoughts for anyone. He was just, and sometimes more than just, and gave good words and good gifts with a free hand. But one thing did he hate. That was a false heart. Anyone who did not hold true to the land of his birth, to his emperor, or his creed of right and wrong, was so low and base in the eyes of this great prince that he lost no chance to show him up in his true light. It was this hate of what is false that led him to make a great war on the Buddhist priests. And it was his love of what is just and fair that made him hate the Ashikaga, and spent his all to give the Mikado his rights in the rule of his folks. Though at first he was on good terms with Shogun rule, he got in a feud with the man he put in that post at Kyoto, and when he had held sway for 6 years or so, Nobunaga drove him off, and broke up the might of the Ashikaga house, though it had held the realm in its grasp for near 150 years. Then for 20 years Japan had no shogun. For this great son of Kiyomori's line, though the chief man of the realm, could not trace his birth to the Gen race, and no one else could be the great shogun. But he had charge of the troops, and held the post in all but name. With the aid of his right-hand men, 4 great generals, whose names rose to fame in more ways than one, he brought large tracts of the realm, which still held off from the Mikado's rule, to own his sway. Like Yoritomo, he had great skill and force of will on the field, but he could not bring the chief clans to bow to him, nor could he hold in peace those whom he had won in war, as Yoritomo did. Still he was a great man, and his name will live with the Japanese through all time. But he has more fame as a man who could rule like a king, who could set up and pull down shoguns, and drive out a race which had held sway for hundreds of years, than as a great chief in the clan fights. He did one more work, more great than all these, and a work for which the Buddhists in Japan still look on him as their worst foe, as one for whom they cannot feel too much hate, though their faith ought to teach them not to hate at all. Nobunaga saw that the whole band of the Buddhist priests of that day was full of wrong and guilt, and that most, if not all, of the priests were false to their creeds and their vows, and he took it on himself to break down the worst sects, and purge them of their pride and vice, while at the same time he took pains to treat well the priests of the faith of Christ, who came from the West in the same year that the name of Nobunaga was first heard through the realm. He had been brought up with priests when a child, so he did not feel for them the awe that most folks had. He had been taught in the Shinto, and did not like the Buddhists any way, and so was more quick to see their sins than he would have been if he had been taught to feel that they could do no wrong. He saw that they were not a great cult of pure, good men, whose one thought was for their faith, but that they were like the rest of men, and worse sometimes. They had rooms full of arms, which they could use as well as the Shogun's troops, and with which they oft left desk and shrine to fight in the clan wars. But in those times of such great strife, they might have done this, and done well, if their thoughts had been for their books and their faith when they were at home. But in place of that, they made their faith a cloak for anything they might want to do, and they grew to want to do all that any men did, and a great deal that some men would not do. Their chief place was on Lake Biwa, and there this sort of life was at its worst, and when the priests were not at grand rites, or in their rooms at feasts and wines and all sorts of good times, they were deep in schemes to make themselves more great in the eyes of the folks, and to foil the plans of Nobunaga. In turn for this, he made up his mind to wipe them out. Of course, he did not make any talk of this till he felt that the time had come to act. Then, with his vast ranks, he camped near the shore of the lake, and told his chiefs to set fire to the great town-like castle of the monks. The chiefs heard this with awe. Since the year 800 this grand old place had stood, and it was thought to be the home of some of the best men in the world. It was the stronghold of the whole realm against the Prince of Wrong. At first they did not think their chief could mean what he said, but he told them of how he had rid the realm of thieves, had run any risk to his life for the sake of his lord on the throne at Kyoto, that he might at last bring peace to the land. He told them that he had learnt that there was no worse ill in the land than this great seat of the Buddhists, which, for the same cause that he had fought the rest of his fights, he now bade them send up in flames. Then he told them what he knew of the aims and the lives of the priests. So at his word his men went on to burn shrines and homes, and to ply sword, lance, and dart to all who dwelt within those walls. Old men and babes, dames, maids, and priests all met with the same fate. At last it was done. The great monastery of Hiezan was no more. Nobunaga's first blow at Buddhism fell with a force that crushed all in its way. This made the rest of the priests dread and hate him more than they had in times past. But for all that, he kept his place at the head of the realm, and grew more great and strong all the while. 9 years from the time the monastery on Lake Biwa was burnt, 2 of the Buddhist sects, whose views were not just the same, got in a sort of feud, and made so much talk that the Mikado was told of it, and word was sent out that Nobunaga should hear the rest of their talk and should be their judge. This was done, and an end was put to the feud and to one of the sects, whose views it was thought would do harm to the state. For 12 years, one of the chief seats of Nobunaga's Buddhist foes was the great monastery of Osaka. Their feud with him was that he let the Catholics come in from the west and build up their shrines and spread their faith. These Buddhists made their home a place where the foes of the great chief could hide from him, and there plots to thwart him were laid. Nobunaga knew all this, but he was a man who could bide his time with his foes, and at last his time came. One day, when his troops were out near this great fort of the monks, some of his best men were slain by a band of what the Japanese call grass rebels, that is, men who watch for and shoot at their foes while they hide themselves by some bush or tree. As soon as they had shot their darts, they fled to the fort of the monks. At this he set out with a will to serve this stronghold of the Buddhists, as he had done that on Lake Biwa. He laid siege to it. Some tried to fly and were slain. Post on post had to give up to the troops of the great chief, and scores of men, women, and babes were put to death. At last the Mikado, in grief that so much blood was shed, sent 3 of his men from court and a Buddhist priest of a sect at Kyoto to beg them to yield, which they did. Nobunaga's foes gave up their fort, with all their shrines, their homes, and the things that were dear to them, into his hands. From then till now it has been held by the state. The chief said he would spare those who still lived. The priests were to live with other monks of their sect, but their might and pride was gone, and at no time since has the faith been so strong as it was ere this great siege. More than once since then the Mikados have had to take steps to check them when they bore too high a hand, but it was not a hard task, for the faith never got over the blows dealt to it by Nobunaga. Now the prince, in his zeal to rid Japan of these old sects that had grown to be a curse to her, gave the aid of his good will to some priests of the Church of Christ, who came from far off Portugal, to bring, as they said, a new faith to the Japanese, but who, in truth, did naught but bring them a new bane. They had come in the wake of some seamen of Portugal, who had a taste that led them to cruise in strange seas, and were cast by storms on the shores of some of the South Isles of Japan. This was in the first days of Nobunaga's fame, and near the same time that the folks of Spain got their foothold in our own land, which, like Japan, was then new to all Europe. The daimyo, on whose coast these men were cast, sent word for them to go and see him, which they did, and he used them well. He gave them the means to go to Goa, which was the chief town of the Portuguese states in India, and he got them to say that each year they would send him a ship full of such goods as would sell in his towns. This they did, and once, when one of these ships lay in port, Anjiro, a Japanese of Satsuma, who had slain a man, fled to it to hide, and was borne off to Goa. There he met the great saint of the Church of Rome, Francis Xavier, whom the King of Portugal had sent to his lands in India to spread the faith there. From him Anjiro heard of Christ. Ere long he took the new faith in place of his own, and came to be so well learnt in all that was taught in it, that the great priest would have him help to spread it in his own land. So, with a few more men, they went to Japan, and set to work in Satsuma in 1549, the year in which Nobunaga fell heir to the lands of his sire. From there they went on, and though in some fiefs they met with kind words and crowds to give ear, while Anjiro told them what the great priest said, and in some they found most of the folks cold to them, still they kept on, and not a few of those who heard them were baptized. At last Xavier lost heart. When in Kyoto he found that war and trade were the two great thoughts of the folks, and that he could find no chance to see the Mikado or the great Shogun. He made up his mind to give up his work there, but he left the seeds of the new faith in more than one soul, who took up the task of the saint. In 5 years from the time Xavier left Kyoto, there were 6 of their churches in or near Kyoto itself, and scores of them had sprung up in the southwest. At the time of Nobunaga's death, more than 100,000 Japanese of all castes had come to be Catholics, and there were 200 of their churches in the realm. The Portuguese brought something more than a new faith to the realm of isles. It was they, and on their first trip, too, who brought the first guns and powder that the Japanese had seen, and taught them how to make the firearms which in a few years were used a great deal through the whole realm. To this day there are not a few folks in the realm who think that Christianity and guns mean much the same thing, and link with both the thoughts of a world of grief and ills that they brought. End of chapter 13.